Ready. Are we live? I'm getting a notification saying we're live on Facebook.
Oh, we must be live then.
All right, we're going to try something new today. Doing a little live election reaction. We just got the majority government call from the networks. So three of us are hopping on the line tonight. Kids are in bed, and we're just going to go for, I don't know, half an hour, 45 minutes, and give our initial take on the election results. And yeah, talk about some of the exclusive polling that we ran during the campaign, where this points our campaigns in the post-election period with an NDP majority. And yeah, we'll lift the hood a little bit on some of our strategy during the election. And yeah, I think it's going to be a good time. So I'm Kai Nagata. I work at Dogwood. I'm on Gixan territory in northern BC. And we've got Lisa and Alexandra joining as well.
Yeah, I'm Lisa Sammartino. I'm Digital Engagement Manager with Dogwood, and I am currently on the unceded territory of the Kwantlen, Katzie, and Sami Nations.
Hey everyone, it's Alexandra here. I'm Campaigns Manager, lead our climate work, and I am on Shisha territory on the Sunshine Coast.
So what's the seat count out right now?
We've all switched off our feeds because we're live here.
It's 54? An NDP majority.
It's like a majority. There we go, 54-30.
Yeah, 50 something. That's pretty convincing. You'd have to have like a very late ferry for them to all miss a vote. I don't think this government's going to go down as the bells ring in the legislature. This is a solid majority government. So we've got an NDP government led by John Horgan for the next 4 years. Initial impressions?
Some interesting things out in Langley, I must say. Mary Polak, who is longtime BC Liberal, she was a cabinet minister. She may be unseated in Langley by NDP newcomer. Also in Langley East, really tight race. Last I looked, Megan Dykeman for the NDP was leading, and that used to be Rich Coleman's seat. So things are heating up out here in Langley in a way I've never seen before.
Yeah.
3 votes for the Greens. I know there was a lot of nervousness or chatter yesterday that the NDP were really going for some of those Green seats on the island in particular, so definitely pleased to see them holding on to 3 at least, maybe 4, but so Sonia Furstenau, Adam Olsen holding on to their seats, and I think it's going back and forth between West Nancy Deskai, Jeremy Valeriotti, and Nelson Creston, right? And I'm gapping on the name there. Anyone remember?
Yeah, Nicole Charlwood is just a hair behind. Oh, she's about 3 points back now from Brittany Anderson. Yeah, 7 different ridings, I think, where the Greens were leading at different points this evening, which I've never seen before on an election night. So they've got to be feeling pretty good about that. And it gives them sort of a sense of where to put resources and organizing muscle over the next few years, I suppose. I got to say, like on a strategy level, you got to hand it to the New Democrats. It was a little bit ruthless to go to an election when the Green Party had like a leader for 7 days, but they accomplished exactly what they set out to do. They rolled the dice, they got their majority. The voters didn't punish them too much for the pandemic election call. And if you walk back a few steps, I mean, the reason why they're able to form a majority government today with like 44% of the vote is because they torpedoed our chances at electoral reform with the referendum that prevented what would have been like a permanent Green foothold in the legislature. So if you look at the results tonight, the popular vote, if the Greens had a 16% popular vote, that's like 18 seats in the legislature in BC. It would be impossible to govern without them forever. And I think that the brain trust in the NDP wanted to avoid that scenario, always has. And this election was always about getting out from under that CASA, not having to govern with the Greens looking over their shoulder, and ultimately trying to crush them and take seats, which didn't work out on the island. But I think in terms of marginalizing the Greens and taking them out of that catbird seat in the legislature, that was the unspoken goal of the NDP campaign, and they pulled it off. So You know, a little ruthless, like I said, but you got to hand it to them in terms of just pure bare knuckle political strategy.
Yeah, I mean, the Greens tried to hold them accountable to that. They said, like, why would the NDP launch us into an election? I don't know if anybody sitting where the NDP were in the polls going into the election would have made a different call. I mean, but it was a gamble. We didn't know what the COVID numbers were going to do. They did go up. With school coming back in, schools could have gotten closed. Big gamble for the NDP on that one. But I think we heard early on that they thought voters would forget this by the time they work in their ballots, and clearly they were right. So it wasn't a voting issue, although a lot of COVID issues in general were the main things on people's minds when they made their decision. So traditionally we've seen things like, I don't know, climate coming to the top of campaigns' platforms. Maybe didn't see that as strongly this time, at least from the NDP. So COVID dominated for sure in the platforms. Yeah, but maybe it didn't make a difference in whether people were punishing the NDP for calling an election in the first place.
And it's clearly going to impact how soon we have final results, right? Like this is, you know, it's in comfortable territory. It doesn't sound like this is going to be the nail biter that we saw in 2017 in terms of those tight races. That was another question mark, right? Going into tonight was, will we all be waiting for, you know, 2-3 weeks to find out what's happening in our riding or, you know, broadly speaking across the province, but it doesn't look like that panned out.
Yeah, at least not
across voting. Like I was in the poll, I was there today, right? I voted today. I didn't vote in advance and I went off with my kid and cast my ballot and they were saying it's just super busy all day, right? Like didn't have the impression, folks who've been working in the polling stations like multiple years, that this was a different scenario on the day as it turned out for a day of election.
Yeah, I mean, across the province, it's clear the NDP are not going to lose their majority when the mail-in ballots get counted. It's still 13 days until we hear what happens with the final results. I don't know all the specifics of like how close each riding is and how many mail-in ballots are for that riding to know what specifically is going to change hands, but I imagine there might be a couple that turn out a little differently 13 days from now. It's not going to be like 2017 where we all waited around for Courtney Comox to slip in and ended up switching from the Liberals to the NDP, but certainly something I imagine would look different. I just don't have those statistics.
Well, we did see some polling during the final days of the campaign asking whether people had voted already by mail and what their sort of vote preference was. And I think it was about 50% for the NDP. So if anything, I'd expect the NDP vote count to strengthen a little bit as those mail-in ballots come back, because I think, you know, the folks that were most excited about voting early were the people who were fired up about, you know, rewarding the government for its handling of the pandemic. The kinds of people who are like, you know, excited to try voting by mail and who are super COVID conscious and, you know, they're really taking the social distancing seriously. I think are people who are really bought in on the government's handling of COVID. And it's not surprising that there was such strong support for the incumbents. And speaking of polling, unlike 2013, my God, looks like the polling held, which has got to be like a sigh of relief for all the polling firms who've missed calls over the last few years in different elections. But I don't know, what are we looking at right now in terms of popular vote? 35 for the Liberals, 44 for the NDP, 16 for the Greens. That's pretty much bang on in terms of what we were seeing for vote intention. And it held pretty steady. This wasn't like a surge election where, you know, one party just starts taking off in the last week, like Rachel Notley in 2015 in Alberta, or, you know, the federal Liberals the same year. So yeah, it was a pretty hold steady election. And I think the pollsters have got to feel pretty good about their calls. But yeah, once again, we live in a system where 44% support gets you a thumping majority. Lisa, you were talking about just some of the factors that led to Horgan calling the election when he did. You want to talk more about just why we had this election? Why we're sitting here tonight?
Well, I mean, Horgan was the most popular premier in the country all summer. BC has handled the pandemic incredibly well. I don't know whether we can credit the government or to Bonnie Henry or to people like actually doing social distancing. But Horgan was.
BC has a lot of like Asian diaspora communities that took the quarantine measures really, really seriously, who are wearing masks and social distancing and shutting down restaurants in January. So I think you got to give some credit just to everyday British Columbians for, having that discipline early on, I think it kept our case numbers low.
Absolutely. But Horgan reaped the rewards in the polls. So, I mean, he's going in, he went into September really strong, but like I mentioned, it was a gamble. We had schools opening again, didn't know if those would shut down. If those shut down, parents get angry, or, you know, if there's an exposure event at school, people's lives are at risk. So that's a big gamble for them to take. But like I said, they took it and it clearly paid off for them. It's kind of an interesting watching the pandemic come too, because they've been printing money. They've been spending money on people, like, and federally as well. Like, money has no value. And that
it turns out
suddenly debt, no big deal.
Yeah.
I mean,
and like
it's been shocking just seeing that shift, you know, after like the last 20, 30 years of neoliberal politics around austerity and debt, that has just like melted like a snowstorm in July. It's been crazy to watch.
Yeah, and those like social measures that that sort of like social net that typically the NDP puts forward, but more fiscal conservatives don't support that. Definitely kind of melted away, and everybody understood that we were all working together to keep the province afloat. That being said, it'd be nice to see that in other areas. I mean, around the overdose crisis, some spending has been called for there, same with climate. So it would be nice to see this like pan-partisan, I want to say like, spending for things that matter and to lift up our communities together, continue forward, but only time will tell.
Sure, plenty of people have drawn the parallels, right, between COVID and the climate crisis. You know, and exactly what we need is decisiveness, this readiness to spend, the readiness to take these bold shifts in our personal lives and our political lives when a crisis is in front of us. And the problem is, climate change has always been described as a slow-moving crisis rather than something that's, you know, threatening us in this very moment. But of course, wildfires, as we just saw, have revealed that it is threatening us here and now, and that kind of, you know, Seth Klein, who has, you know, recently talked about, he has a book out called The Good War, and does a really great job of showing that kind of mobilization that we've seen on COVID and how that could really turn things around if we were to adopt that approach on climate change.
What do you make of the ground we've lost, Alexandra? Like, electorally and politically, I was just thinking today about 2006 or 2007 when Al Gore came out with Inconvenient Truth, and there was like this sense of urgency around climate in politics. And, you know, we're in 2020 and the Greens were in their strongest position ever. You know, like the coin flip landed on its edge in 2017. That was their moment. And now, you know, they're out of that position. Where do you think that's going to take us with, you know, the NDP being able to govern with that majority and not have the Greens, you know, holding that 3-seat wedge over them? Yeah,
I mean, it's tricky, right? And I think, you know, that's definitely been the other reason that's been voiced around why we had this election is, the desire to kind of get out from that, from holding the balance of power, right? And I think there's been some healthy skepticism about that as well, that, you know, that was an excuse that was voiced quite explicitly around a couple of different bills, Bill 2017, which was a kind of energy bill that the Greens and Liberals worked together to get tabled and that kind of thing. So there were a few different instances where, you know, during this campaign anyway, Horgan and others pointed to, you know, the Greens holding back their agenda. Personally, I'm a little skeptical of that, you know, the reasons that Lisa outlined earlier and the opportunity to grab that majority probably being more of a driving force. But you know, for a lot of environmental voters, a lot of climate voters, you know, we held hope. We thought, look, the Greens have the balance of power. How can we, this is our moment, right? As you say. And the Greens they did their best. They did a lot. They voted against, you know, subsidies time after time after time. They obviously, you know, were for doing the best they can, but we still saw this lack of progress on all these issues we all care so much about. So, you know, that is a kind of depressing and quite scary prospect when if we see what happened with the Greens holding the balance of power on LNG, on old growth, on Site C, on, you know, a whole bunch of things, on just like lack of ambition on climate, broadly speaking. What do we do now with a strong NDP majority? We've got 3 seats perhaps from the Greens, but those aren't the balance of power seats. So I know a lot of people are going to be feeling worried. I personally just kind of have that big question, right, of like, what what's our role now going forward? When, what are us as a social movement? It's us, right? Like it's us who are going to have to do that job, and we're going to have to really support the Greens because they don't have that same, that same strength that they had before. And of course, even that wasn't enough to move us farther and faster on climate, particularly the way we moved.
You could flip that around, though. I mean, I remember covering the Quebec legislature when Quebec Solidaire got their first seat, and there's a role for like truth tellers in the legislature. And I think when the Greens were bound by the CASA agreement, and especially under Weaver, who really enjoyed, being part of government and had this notion that they were sort of like part of a, this important coalition. And I think that sense was really fed by Horgan. He played to Weaver's ego a lot around, the significance of the CASA. And without that agreement, the Greens they're under less obligation to sort of play by the NDP's agenda, right? And they have, I think, more leeway perhaps to try to use what resources they have to broaden the conversation, to make sure that somebody in the legislature is speaking out, because the BC Liberals are unlikely to take up that mantle as the official opposition. So, it might free them in some ways to say things that they couldn't say when they were bound by the CASA. I have a couple other theories or just observations about the timing of the election. And we'll see. We'll play this tape back in a couple of years and see if it's true. But I think that there's a big problem in the NDP base with Indigenous resistance, especially to, fracking projects like the Coastal GasLink pipeline, big publicly subsidized, old school, big money infrastructure projects. When you've got the cops pointing rifles at people and, throwing people in their face down in the snow, NDP supporters and voters and staff and donors, they really don't like that. And we saw that split the party, and we see, I think, a growing call to action. People using the Shutdown Canada hashtag again the last couple of weeks in response to these unrelenting assaults on Indigenous communities across Canada. And that, I think, is reaching a boiling point. If Horgan had left this election a couple weeks later, who knows what's going to unfold in response to the Mi'kmaq fishery attacks, the raid on Landback Lane in Haudenosaunee territory, and of course, Trans Mountain construction and Coastal GasLink here in BC. So I think something is going to boil over very soon. And, if that had happened before an election call, who's to say how that would have played out? So, going early was, it made sense from the perspective of keeping the NDP base together and focused on healthcare and these sort of motherhood and apple pie issues that none of them can really disagree on. Whereas, if you've got the provincial police, going in like cowboys, raiding Indigenous communities, that is going to split the NDP base. And that would be, I think, really demoralizing, as it was for the last couple of raids on Wet'suwet'en territory, when we saw a bunch of NDP donors and supporters tearing up their membership cards. And the last thing is Site C. I mean, this thing is going to be a complete train wreck. And the Narwhal article that came out a couple days before the election revealed that they've known about this for 18 months, that the foundation is not solid, that this might not be a project that can be completed. The engineers don't know how to fix it, and BC Hydro doesn't know how much it's going to cost. So if this dam can't be built, and we've blown $8 or $10 billion on it, if hydro rates go up, it's not just environmentalists who are going to be pissed off. It's going to be anybody with a hydro bill, right? And it's going to be the government of the day. You can't just keep blaming the BC Liberals when you're deep into your second term. They were the ones who decided to go ahead with this project, and they're the ones who, it looks like, covered up the fact that this dam has serious geological issues. They're going to cost ratepayers billions of dollars. So somebody's going to have to be held responsible for that. And I think if they had left that, and even gone to an election next fall, stuff was going to come out about this massive boondoggle on the Peace River that is going to be really, really damaging to the NDP. And I wouldn't be surprised if you see senior ministers losing their jobs over this. So we'll see how the Site C fiasco plays out. But I think that was another reason why, actually, it was former Dogwood staffer Mike Soron was on Twitter saying we're going to look back in a couple of years and see that this was a big factor in the election timing, was going before the public really got a grasp on how bad the screw up has been on Site C.
And they're going to grapple with that really soon, right? Like, we're expecting a report out in the next few weeks. Obviously they were waiting for the election, but from what Minister Heyman, and I think even in the leaders debate, there was a real shift in tone from both those folks saying, previously they were pressing ahead, this is happening. And the tone was very much like, we will be making a decision. We'll be looking at this news. And if it makes sense, we'll, keep all our options on the table. And that looks like something they're going to face and grapple with, and where, as you say, this is going to be on them in the end, not on the Liberals who pushed it past the point of no return soon. So it's going to be like, the first exciting thing, the new dumpster fire, the financial dumpster fire that is, BC Hydro's finances.
Yeah. There is no point of no return if you can't build the dam. Like if they physically can't anchor to the foundations, there's no point of no return. They should cancel it. Do you want to talk about just the goals that we had going into this election and how those panned out, lessons learned? Lisa, I know you were supporting the Vote 16 team, the youth team on lowering the voting age. You want to talk about the goals that we had there and what we're carrying over?
Yeah, so Dogwood has been supporting this team of about 50 grassroots youth who are running this campaign to lower the voting age. They're an incredible group. They're incredible organizers and communications, and they're just a lot of fun to work with. They had a commitment going into this that meant to see lowering the voting age in every platform for the major political parties. They were able to get that for the BC Greens, and full credit where credit is due. They worked very hard and talked to the Greens a lot. They did have a resolution passed at the Greens last year in support of lowering the voting age, and the Greens have had that in their platform before. So it was a pretty exciting win for them as well. On the NDP, at the NDP convention last fall, they did organize a resolution to lower the voting age, and it was passed with like overwhelming support. But we haven't heard anything about it since then, and they were hoping to see some of the conversations come up again, and maybe see it in the forum, but we hadn't seen that this time. Some candidates did tell us that they were in support, so the team will look for that after, look to those people who were elected after the election and the dust settles to see what we can do in the legislature. But they was fairly disappointing. I mean, the Greens came in and they said, like, we support youth and we support youth in every way. They ran a 17-year-old candidate who turned 18 right before the election. And then I think 7 other candidates under the age of 25. And so they were really committed to youth issues. The NDP, not so much. I mean, we didn't see any big jumps in their campaign and their platform promises. Anyways, they played a very safe race because they were so strong in the polls. They didn't need to court the youth vote. And it becomes unfortunately becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy when you say, like, well, youth don't vote, or they don't vote for me, my party, so why give them anything to vote for? And it just becomes this cycle. So they were maybe a little disappointed, but some fruitful things to go forward with there. But it does beg the question, right? Like, what are they afraid of? Like, what are people afraid of when they engage with youth? What are they afraid that youth will do? So I think there's something to do with youth. They're organizing. They're bringing out 100,000 people into the streets for a climate march, and they're a force to be reckoned with. And the like institutional politics need to like take a step back and realize that. So
it's a freight train. You can either get on board or you can get in the way.
Yeah.
And you mentioned this Saanich South candidate for the Greens, Kate
Yeah.
O'Connor. I don't think this is the last we've heard from Kate O'Connor. I was watching Power and Politics, and she was on like a national political panel, totally holding her own. She's really like articulate and on the ball. She's incredible. She's like 18 years old. So I would be threatened.
She's not an exception.
No, and she's
the rule.
I mean, from talking to a lot of the folks that are working on the Vote 16 campaign, just their analysis and their commitment and just their clear-eyed view of how all the issues link together. I thought I was a total shithead when I was 17. Like, I can't even imagine myself going on Power and Politics. That, like, it's been so inspiring to watch, but I would be threatened if I was running against her. Like, that's the thing, is like these, it's mostly young women. They're incredibly powerful, and you can't attack them. Like, you can't do the same old dirty politics and try to undermine them. right? You actually have to fight them toe to toe. And that's really scary. So I can see why people in power in this province are threatened by that.
It's also the way
Go
they
ahead.
connect the dots between issues, right? Like the way, yeah, of course, their power is threatened by organized people who are connecting systemic racism with climate justice, with capitalism, and the structures that are keeping so many different kinds of people down, right? So when that is a direct threat to the status quo and to those who benefit from and hold power through the status quo, and that is exactly what these youth are showing us. And of course, therefore, it's a threat to the large majority of office holders continue to be that demographic, right?
And that's exactly it. I mean, you said you were this kid that wouldn't have been involved in this stuff when you were younger, but like all of these issues are coming to a head right now. Indigenous rights, racial justice, climate change. They have no choice. Like at this point, their lifespans will be shortened by climate change. Their communities will be devastated. They have no choice. And by the simple characteristic of being young, their lives are greater impact on their lives than for us. And so, no, the end game is not to lower the voting age. The end game is to lower the voting age so they can have better policies to help their lives. They're literally fighting for their lives at this point. And yeah, so I mean, we haven't heard the last of them. Youth are going to be a disruptive force to politics, and it's a privilege to work with them.
I agree. If people were watching Dogwood's social media channels, I mean, you would have heard a lot from us about oil and gas subsidies. Alexandra, do you want to talk about our strategy there and why we chose to focus so relentlessly on that topic for the last 5 weeks?
Yeah, it's funny. I was just thinking of chatting about this, and I was like, we must sound like a broken record at this point, right? Whenever we mention the words oil and gas subsidies, anyone who's been following us is like, we're done, we're bored of this. But you know, I still get angry, literally. Like I feel my blood pressure rise every time I sit down and actually think about the concept of us paying these companies who are fueling climate change, who are getting richer off the climate crisis, our tax dollars. Like it literally makes me angry every time. And it's not new for us. We've been working on this for several years now. We've been working federally around subsidies. We did a lot of the same kind of messaging, same kind of work in the federal election last year. So this is definitely something that Dogwood has been actively engaged on and pushing forward in other forums for a long time now. And in this election, I think, it is the pass-fail test really for anyone who's serious about climate action. It is such a basic first step, the idea of stopping handing over cash to these companies that are causing the climate crisis to get worse. It shouldn't be a hard thing. It should be a no-brainer. And I think when we saw some candidates entering the race who had been so vocal on this issue in the past, we had 3 MPs who, if you've seen our videos, and they're shouting at Trudeau, telling him to get serious about climate change and cancel oil and gas subsidies. So we had 3 of those, as well as a couple. We had Nikki Sharma and others who had been really passionate within the last year about ending subsidies. So we kind of had this, really thought, let's put that out there. Let's put this ask out there to all candidates to make this commitment to when in government to end these subsidies. And really, did a lot of work to kind of give them that opportunity, ask our folks to ask their candidates what they thought, did a lot of videos and fantastic stuff going out there, and really put that content in front of them and said, what do you say? What are you going to do if you get elected? And unfortunately, in a similar vein, not a single one stepped up and voiced the same values, the same statements that they had done in other forums, which is disappointing. It's disappointing to climate voters. I don't personally feel like they're likely to, once they're in office, get bolder than they would have been now when they're trying to win that seat. Now was the time for them to make those comments. So that's a little bit disappointing, to say the least. In terms of the different parties where they all broke down, obviously the Greens did a big thing of this in their platform and in their campaign. I think they really saw this thing as this kind of wedge issue of defining what serious climate action looks like. The NDP has promised to review royalty credits. That was their, that's how they responded to that question. So royalty credits are kind of like the rent that, mostly fracking companies pay to the citizens of BC for extracting this resource that belongs to all of us. But it's only like about a fifth, right, of the total pie. It's about a fifth of the $1 billion in subsidies that gets handed over. And personally, I mean, a review, a kind of blue ribbon panel at some point in the future to review a problem when we have 8 years left to address this crisis and to turn the ship around, doesn't sound to me like, like seriousness. It doesn't sound like the urgency, the boldness that we're all expecting and needing from governments right now. But it does give us an opportunity to hold this majority government. This is our way in, right? And this is how we're going to keep working with the Green MLAs and with the movement that we've built. That will be a great opportunity when that review comes forward to really hold their feet to the fire and push them further.
Yeah, and hopefully expand the terms of review and get more things counted as subsidies. I hear you on the anger. I think for me, it's both anger and like physical revulsion, like physical disgust. And we put a video out that it was an experiment, but one of our freelance editors put together a really funny sort of like horror parody with like a bunch of parasites, just like ticks and grubs and things. And that is how I feel. Like that's how I want everybody in BC to feel after like another 2 years of this campaign. When they hear oil and gas subsidies, I want them to feel like there's like something growing in the political body of BC that is like feeding off of our public dollars, that is like squeezing out the other things that we could be funding and investing in. Just a malignant boil that needs to be just lanced. When we ran the Ban Big Money campaign, our joke slogan was "Lance the Boil 2017" or whatever. And yeah, I mean, I have that same kind of gut level physical revulsion around oil companies taking tax dollars from British Columbians. But yeah, speaking of Ban Big Money, Lisa, I think you haven't been getting a lot of credit publicly. There's been a few articles in the newspapers about how the campaign finance rules have led to a more polite and, above board, small dollar campaign. But do you want to reflect a little bit just on Ban Big Money and the whole journey towards more transparent, more accountable government?
This election was completely different in that way. Hey, like in 2017, we saw huge amounts of money. Like the Aquilinis wrote a check in the lead up to the 2017 election, a single check for $100,000. Like you can't do that anymore. So I think CBC ran some numbers and said this year, or 2018 last year, nope, not last year. Sorry, the year after the Ban Big Money legislation came in, 2018. The Liberals and the NDP raised $3 million as opposed to $16 million the year before. And those are coming now from small donors and individual human beings who actually live here. So a huge difference, and it's affected the parties in different ways. The Greens have fared fairly well. I mean, a lot of donations came from small-time individual donors as well. The NDP seems to have fared relatively well compared to the BC Liberals, who just cannot get their feet under them when it comes to fundraising. There was this quote from BC Liberal strategist after the Ban Big Money legislation came in, and she said, like, our party is funded by a diverse group of individual British Columbians who share our values. And you're like, but it wasn't, clearly, because you just can't seem to raise the same amount of money. So it did make a difference in what voters saw. We didn't see the same level of campaigning that we saw before. Some of that might be COVID related, like no buses around the province, but yeah, it's definitely made a difference for sure. That being said, though, like when water is trickling in, it's always going to find a way through the wood, and unless you seal it up. And there's Facebook now releases all of their advertising and makes that all transparent, so you can see like how third-party advertisers during the election are trying to influence policy in their own way, and so I think there's still a lot to be done to make it truly accountable, and we might be seeing some of the hangout of that still. So like in 2017, which was an election year and the last year that you could donate as a union or a corporation with those big checks, the steelworkers gave $1.1 million to the NDP in a single year, and wrote a check for $500,000 right before they were, single check, right before it dropped that you weren't allowed to do that anymore. And there's some questions there, right? Like the steelworkers have been big advocate of the LNG industry. So there might be some hangovers there that British Columbians need to ask some questions about, and that we need to seal up some of the cracks still.
Yeah, and there's just other ways of exerting influence, right? Like Mark Marison, big BC Liberal strategist, was saying on Twitter that the line item in the budget for like influencing politics at big corporations hasn't gone anywhere. It's not going to like, buying tables at banquets anymore, but they're going to find other ways of spending to influence not just elected office holders, but staff in the premier's office, like senior staff, and civil service, right? You've got all of these deputy ministers and ADMs that have been inexplicably kept over from the BC Liberal era, like Fazil Millar and until recently, Dave Nicolojan at the Energy, Mines and Petroleum Resources Ministry. So you've got these like hardcore neoliberal BC Liberal appointee that Horgan never got rid of. And these guys exert enormous influence. They're the ones who've been running the government for the last 5 weeks while all the politicians were off, on the campaign trail. And the reality is they exert a huge amount of influence around especially natural resource and energy policy that doesn't change when you change the branding on the government. So there's, give them a majority, and I worry about the access to information that citizens are going to have, the transparency, the things that we never find out about, like the Site C foundations, just, buried for 18 months. Those are the kinds of stories that we're going to have to spend a lot more energy digging up when they've got majority power, and all of that power is consolidated in the premier's office.
And we know those like daily lobbying contacts aren't going down, right? But like that's a whole separate basket of influence. And we know that those, the corporate mapping project has done this great job of laying out, this kind of revolving door of just, multiple, I think it's like 15 contacts a day from the oil and gas industry to the provincial government. So that's another really clear line and a clear, explanation for what's happening, for what we're seeing when we are seeing this lack of ambition.
Yeah. I was hoping we could switch gears and talk a little bit about some of the polling we did during the campaign, sort of what that tells us about where British Columbians are at, and maybe we'll wrap up just talking about where our campaigns are headed in the future under this strong, stable majority government. Where does that leave us as campaigners? So we did sign on to a big sort of omnibus poll that was run by Organizing for Change. So we're a member of the Alliance Organizing for Change. It's a dozen or so groups, mostly environmental and conservation groups in BC. And so we hired McAllister Opinion Research to do a big poll with about 2,000 respondents around the province. And I think there's some interesting bright spots that I did want to highlight that I think are indicative of shifts in the BC populace in the last few years. We've asked similar questions or the same questions in the past, and especially around Indigenous rights. I just wanted to highlight a couple of responses that we got. One was when we asked about how much influence different groups should have over decisions on resource development in BC, the BC government and First Nations are tied. So I've never seen that before, where you add up all the folks who think that they should have, quote, like a great deal or a fair amount of influence, and it's 66 and 67% for those two, like far and above any other stakeholder group in BC. And so, to see them on equal footing with the provincial government around land-based decisions is really promising, but we're still not seeing that reflected on the ground, right? And so, the BC legislature passed the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act last fall, Bill 41, which is a framework to bring our laws into compliance with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. But the real work is yet to come, and that's actually reviewing the laws that are on the books in BC and updating them to bring them into compliance. And we've got 1,000 laws on the books in BC. So there's a huge amount of work that I think grassroots people are going to have to keep the pressure on the government to engage in good faith with the First Nations Leadership Council and start picking off these big contentious bills and updating them through the lens of UNDRIP. And a lot of those are going to be around land-based issues, energy and land management, resource policy, forestry. The other question we asked around Indigenous rights was just whether Indigenous nations should have a right to say no to resource projects in their territories, and a plurality, 37% said that they should, and there was only, I think, 29% who said the opposite, that Indigenous nations should not be allowed to stop resource projects. So again, I've never seen that before, where more people in BC agree that that final decision should be up to Indigenous nations versus, the colonial governments when it comes to resource policy. So yeah, I think there's some other stuff in the poll that's less encouraging, but in terms of just where the BC public is at around Indigenous jurisdiction, decision-making, and traditional law, this is, you got to give credit to the leaders and all of the grassroots folks who have been, just moving this issue forward over the generations. It's been decades and decades and decades to force British Columbia to this point. The work is not over. We're still seeing violations of Indigenous rights every day, but just the fact that the BC public is finally sort of able to wrap their heads around the fact that, the BC government is not the sole decision maker on the land is encouraging. I think that was one thing that I was really happy to see. You want to talk a little bit about some of what popped out to you, Alexandra, on climate issues or on other environmental stuff?
Yeah, it was an interesting one because it compared a lot of language, like different ways to frame the exact same thing. So language matters. For example, the numbers are almost opposite when you say fracking or LNG. So this is like a reminder to all of us who work in the campaigning space that these are the same substances. These are the same things really, and that kind of that matters. And similarly, it totally shifts whether you say pipeline or oil tanker track. But broadly speaking, people do not want to see more. They don't want to see more oil tankers on our coast, as we know, as the Dogwood community has been working on for so long. People are not a fan of fracking, not a fan of open pit mining. On the flip side, 71% want to see more renewable energy. So these are like really great things to be working with. The public is on side with what our community is trying to fight for. But the fascinating thing is that they still think the government's doing a good job, which from where I'm sitting is really hard to reconcile. When the kind of opposition to these big mega projects, and then we have a government that is pushing ahead with LNG, with Site C, that Horgan recently called Trans Mountain inevitable. I think his kind of concept of what opposition to Trans Mountain look like is pretty rolled over on that these days, I would say. So that kind of we've got our work cut out for us there, and I think in a few other ways as well. Like the headline, the other really big one was that only 22% of people are seriously concerned that BC is not doing enough to address climate change. So like that's on us as a movement and as campaigners and as organizers. Like that is our job, right? Our job is to get that number up a heck of a lot higher. On the flip side to that, 70% think it's real. It's not unlikely to be stopped. We need to do stuff now. We need to work on this now. It's not far off in the distance anymore. I started doing this work in the mid 2000s, and it was a non-issue. People were like, that's a problem for another day. And that is clearly not where we're at anymore. This is, an existential threat. It's in the top 3 to 5 issues on most polls, broadly speaking. So that's the good news, right? But, and we're obviously comparing this, this poll was done in that time of COVID when, we're competing, this issue is competing against very real pocketbook issues, very real health issues. And I think that's where this idea of public money to oil and gas really comes in, because it links the two, right? It says, one of the questions was asked was, billionaires getting rich at the expense of regular people. Not surprisingly, 72% are not a fan of that, because it's a fairness issue, right? It's around, it's coming back to your point, Kai, of the, it's unfair. It's just fundamentally not the way it should be. We're getting ripped off. And so this is a way to connect the kind of moral rationale for climate action that we all feel as with a kind of pocket, the security, the know that we need to do this for our future, for our kids, and with the kind of here and now and present pocketbook issue and fairness issue, which is really where we need to be taking this conversation as we go forward. But yeah, work cut out for us, no doubt about it.
Yeah, and people have really drunk the Kool-Aid on LNG and on Site C. I think hindsight's 2020. If everybody had been saying fracking instead of LNG for the last 10 years, I'd be interested to see where these numbers are at today. But man, like people have totally bought the industry line that this is a clean fuel that is going to help with climate change. It's going to get, China off coal. And I wouldn't be surprised to see the NDP start to incorporate some of that messaging. It's the groundwork has been laid by the oil and gas industry, to once again present their products as the solution to this big problem. Just like how they invented the whole idea of recycling plastic and everyone went along with it for like 30 years. And then we find out none of it gets recycled. It just gets thrown in the landfill. They're saying, look, like this fracked methane, enormously energy intensive, creates all these earthquakes, leaves, millions of gallons of poison in the ground. And then you light it on fire, and that is good for the climate. It's incredibly potent greenhouse gas, leaks out of all the wellheads and pipelines, way worse than CO2 from, the moment it's dug out of the ground to the moment it's burned. And, this is going to be great. This is going to really help us on climate change. And people have bought that because they've just spent millions and millions and millions of dollars hammering that message home. And we're really going to have to dismantle that one person at a time, because people are just not connecting the dots right now. Christy Clark did a really, really good job selling the whole LNG myth. And yeah, Site C. I've been on this kind of Site C tear lately, but man, everyone believes the sunk cost fallacy. There's a reason why it's a thing in psychology. The more money we spend, the more people feel like, well, we've spent too much money. We can't turn back now. But again, if you literally can't build the dam, it's not a good idea to keep spending billions more dollars trying to drill holes in the mud.
I think just on that, we kind of drank the Kool-Aid on, on Christy Clark's message. It's very similar. The oil industry as a whole has done a great job of blaming consumers and blaming individuals, and individuals have internalized that. And, some of that is reflected in this polling around, you can't blame fossil fuel companies for their product. They're just responding to demand. And, that individuals, we all bear responsibility, being came up more higher than, the companies must bear responsibility for climate change. But when you look at the numbers overall, historically, and broadly speaking, the lion's share of emissions is from like a very small number of fossil fuel companies, and that's just reality, right? But they've done a fantastic job.
It's not ExxonMobil starting wars around the world and Saudi Aramco. It's you going to get groceries and driving your kids to soccer. That's what's really to blame here. I mean, if you didn't, enjoy your Western living standards, maybe everybody would be better off.
Yeah, and I think that comes back to that, around, youth being a threat to power. It's the same, is very much of a similar argument there. There is invested power in trying to keep that message the way it is, right? And it's a very similar dynamic there, which is, something we need to, we have always, this movement that's what it's about, right? It's about revealing that Exxon knew. We all know this, and we need to make that message louder.
But where are people at on oil and gas subsidies?
Yes, specifically, yeah. So they don't like billionaires getting richer, and 61% agree with our kind of, our pass-fail test from this election, which was stop giving $1 billion to oil and gas companies, invest that money to transition workers to sustainable industry. Yeah, I think it goes back to what I was saying, and this is how we need to. This is the frame we believe is really the successful way to bring the majority of British Columbians on side with the need to pull that money out of that sector and push it into renewable energy, which 71% support. If you're in the climate voter sphere, you're on board with this already, but this is the way to broaden the conversation, broaden the tent, and bring the majority of British Columbians along, which is what we know we need to do to win this kind of a fight.
It goes right back to ban big money, right? The reason why I think that campaign was so successful ultimately is that it tied into all these other issues that people cared about. So if you care about affordable housing, if you care about healthcare, if you care about education, these are things that are being starved right now by the fact that $1 billion a year, plus all of the one-off subsidies like to Coastal GasLink, that's just $1 billion that we can't spend on anything else. And so I think that is a great entry point to conversations with people around priorities, and to governments to choose. Our government is going to have to decide what is a priority, and the longer that they let this fester, I think the more. I'm back on my sort of grub metaphors, but yeah, the longer this festers, I think the worse it's going to be a progressive politician in 2020 giving tax dollars to oil companies.
I make sure of it. We're going to give them a hard time.
Oh yeah, no, we're not done with the oozing grubs or the leeches. Just a couple things I wanted to point out that we noticed, just general questions, not related to our issues, just where the public is at overall. We asked about vaccines, we asked about masks as a method of slowing down COVID, and there's like 15 to 20% of people in the province who are either full on anti-maskers, anti-vaxxers, or they are unsure about the public health benefits. And when you ask about diversity and tolerance, a quarter of people in BC agree that this country would benefit from less emphasis on diversity and tolerance. So there's these are not huge numbers, but a quarter of our population, definitely agreeing with sort of the backlash against civil rights movements in the last few decades. And there was one that we asked that I found both like encouraging and disturbing, which is the question was whether government is mostly controlled by unelected forces. And 37% of people agree. 27% disagree, 37% are unsure. And in many ways, it's true. Like we were talking about the premier's office and the deputy ministers and the political parties. Democracy is controlled in large part by people who are never on the ballot, who you don't have a choice of whether they're in power, and you don't get to pick them every 4 years. And so that's real, and we don't want to lose sight of that. And I think that those people have legitimate concerns, but there's this overlap with like full-on conspiracy thinking. And so we also asked about sort of the flagship of the QAnon conspiracy, which is that politicians are involved in covering up child trafficking. And 19% of people in BC agreed that many of our politicians are involved in covering up child trafficking. Only 42% of people disagreed. The rest were unsure. And so there's a huge chunk of the population that's absorbing straight up conspiracy theory rhetoric off of mostly YouTube, I would guess, and Facebook. And it is eroding our sort of shared sense of reality. And so I think there's a really important job. We can't ignore this anymore. Like I think for a long time, the idea has been to ignore QAnon and ignore conspiracy theories and just, laugh at them if they pop their head up in public, but otherwise just drive them to the dark corners of the internet. Well, that's not working because our social media platforms are engineered to deliver this stuff to people, and it's working. It's convincing more and more people outside of the demographics that you would imagine are like tinfoil hat conspiracy people. So I think we have a real interesting job ahead of us to find the people who agree that government is controlled by unseen forces, that we as the public need to root out power and influence, bring it to the light, hold it up to public scrutiny. We need accountability from our leaders, but pull those people back from like the full-blown conspiracy theories around whatever it is, 5G or masks or coronavirus or child trafficking, because once people go down that rabbit hole, I think it's really hard to get them back. So yeah, I just wanted to point that out and say, used to be everybody read the same newspaper, watched the same newscast, and they all sort of agreed on, how the world fit together. Or at least that's how I imagine the media landscape in the 50s and 60s. And I think that there's something really dark happening now that we can't keep ignoring. We're going to have to engage with this. We're going to have to talk to people in our own lives who are, being pulled down the rabbit hole of conspiracy theories and channel that distrust and alienation in a helpful direction towards the billionaires and the people that are actually screwing us over and ruining our lives. And, if we can do that, then I think we can harness a lot of momentum and bring some of our loved ones back from the brink. But yeah, if we keep ignoring it, we're just going to lose more and more people, I think, to the 4chans and the 8chans and the YouTube channels. Anyway, I just wanted to bring that up. It's a personal hobby horse, but yeah, I think it's going to shape our work as campaigners over the next few years in ways that we haven't yet begun to wrap our heads around. Well, maybe we could start to wrap this thing up. I am curious for your thoughts on where our work goes from here. Lisa, you were hinting at some of the opportunities that are coming up around youth organizing and just the disruptive force that they've created in politics. But where do you see our work going in terms of supporting these young leaders?
Yeah, the team dictates their own strategy and does all the work. Dogwood provides a space. One of the team members was on a TEDx panel last week, and she said, Katia Bannister, she said, like, what youth need are adults to make space for us, and that's what Dogwood's trying to do. So they do dictate all the strategy. I don't have any events. They're doing a pretty good job. But from Dogwood's point of view, our mission is to, restore decision making into the hands of British Columbians over our air, land, and water, and lowering the voting age is essential to that. So to continue to support their work, I do see opportunities coming up. Obviously, I was talking with some of them tonight, and they're already planning their GR and reaching out to successful candidates. So they have some irons in the fire already. We will, unless it's already been announced while we've been on this call, we will most likely see a Liberal leadership race in the next year and a half, 2 years. Which is big opportunities. In the past, 2011, we saw lowering the voting age come up there. From Mike DeJong put forward that as one of his planks of his leadership platform or for his nomination. And so it's not a partisan issue. Everybody can support it. And in Scotland, which is one of the more recent relevant examples of lowering the voting age, cross-party support. So maybe some opportunities around the BC Liberal leadership race, some opportunities with some new MLAs in government now, and like I said, they're going to be a completely disruptive force, and bringing youth along with us is essential to having good progressive climate policy and climate-oriented policy in government. But even just like lowering the voting age will add 100,000 new voters to the electorate, which makes the issues that we share in common with youth, specifically around climate, that much more relevant all of a sudden to politicians. And if we can get them in when they're in high school and they have the supports to vote and they learn those skills and it's part of the curriculum, that voter turnout will follow them through their lives. And it's going to go up through the decades in ways that we haven't seen and influence policies. So from a Dogwood point of view, we can only win by supporting these youth. As for their strategy, I'll leave it to them to decide, but I hope everybody follows along.
Sounds like you have a young voter that might need your attention, or are you
saying wrap it up, mommy?
No. Somebody else is helping her.
Alexandra, where is your mind going on climate issues?
Well, I think with oil and gas subsidies, I mean, it was everywhere this campaign, it really was, quite a defining climate issue. So that is definitely an opportunity to follow up with. And, if we have three green MLAs, we're going to strengthen their hand, and they obviously want to make a big deal of this going forward. So we're going to keep hammering on that front. But I can't look away from the kind of frontline fight that I see coming, that is here already across Canada, obviously, but for folks who've been following Trans Mountain and Coastal GasLink for a long time, it's becoming very real. This is like we've been in this kind of phony war phase on Trans Mountain. Obviously, there has been a very different situation on Coastal GasLink, but I feel like on Trans Mountain, we've been kind of seeing this moment coming at a distance for so long, and I think we are getting very much close to the point of needing to support frontline resistance on the ground, because that is, this pipeline is, broadly speaking, there is only 5% of pipe in the ground. There is billions of dollars still to be saved, but on the ground, for folks who are seeing this in their community, they are saying we need help, right? We need help to stand up and resist this project on the ground. And the big, in Secwepemc territory, in Kamloops, they're drilling out of the Thompson River right now. There's been a big pushback there from grassroots Secwepemc folks. We've had 9 arrests over the last week. And I think that's something we need to amplify. We need to really support that. It's right in the middle of the election campaign. I think the Trans Mountain movement as a whole has been a little distracted, and that's definitely something I'd like to, we need to kind of bring our focus back there. At the same time, we have folks in Wet'suwet'en territory who are also facing their river. At this very moment, they're preparing to drill under the river there. that's a whole different story in that that was the flashpoint for the kind of national solidarity blockades that happened in February. That's a place where this, this group of people have been occupying what is their land for 10 years in resistance and in, opposition to this project. And yeah, it's very real there as well. So, I can't see how, someone who has been following these fights for so long, who sees themselves as a climate activist, who wants to be part of this movement, can really sit on the sidelines any longer with this kind of thing going on. So we put out, a blog a couple of days ago saying we are the official opposition now. So that means a couple different things. I think it means that, if we have a majority NDP government, we have a lack of boldness, a lack of vision, a lack of urgency on climate, broadly speaking. Not in a lot of different ways. There's kind of scary similarities between the Liberal and the NDP platform on climate. We don't have a balance of power with the Greens. We have the Liberals going into a leadership race, as you say, and we have, the opposition, the official opposition, is kind of in disarray in that sense. We have that needs to be healthy, it needs to be robust. It's going to, those will both come up and play their role, but I think we kind of know where we stand now, right? We have this majority. We know where we stand, and we need to push back. We need to be stronger. We need to push back more strongly. And I think that's kind of on the political side. And you both have takes on that too that I'd like to hear about. But I also think that we need to be offering our support to the front lines, where, this is the front lines of the climate crisis, and it's the front lines of decolonization, of supporting communities who are being removed from their own lands, people who are being dragged away at gunpoint from lands that are rightfully theirs. So that's kind of work that we need to do. We need to find ways as Dogwood to draw the links and draw the connections, find ways to connect people who are not ready to go, and no one's going to get arrested, but we are like a middle space, right, where we can bring people, let people know what's going on, let people know how they can support with their money, with their time, with their energy from afar, online, and connect people with those opportunities. So I definitely think we have a role to play there, and a kind of bigger role than we have as these two pipelines try and push through an unwilling province, and that I guarantee you is going to rise up really strongly against that. I
agree, and I'm relieved in a way that the election is over, so that we can put our attention and resources into this. My enthusiasm about the democratic process has waned over the years, as we see, just the inadequacy of our institutions in responding to these rapid, large-scale crises. And I do think we need to start shifting resources and attention and bringing our supporters along. I'm in northern BC, and we just got a weather alert for the weekend, so we're expecting a foot of snow. It's like -8 today, and the Wet'suwet'en folks I was talking to call this raid season. Like, this is the time of year, the last 2 years, when the cops have come in. For whatever reason, they like to do it when it's like -20, -30. Makes it much harder for people to physically hold space or occupy bridges or equipment or anything, because you're at risk of dying of exposure. And so this is raid season, and with the pace and scale of the work, both on Coastal GasLink and Trans Mountain, that I've witnessed with my own eyes in the last couple of months, things are coming to a head, and we're not going to be able to put our heads in the sand. Not just at Dogwood, but as citizens of BC. Like, this is not going to be something that that we can get away from. And so our responsibility is to turn and think about how we can best use our privilege, our resources, our platforms, the access that we may still have to politicians, we'll see, in order to advance these issues and to lift up the voices of people on the front lines. And so I don't know what that's going to look like, but I know that it's essential, that there's no way to remain like a relevant and useful climate organization in 2020 without allying ourselves directly with people on the front lines of this crisis. At an organizational level, I was thinking about this today, and like the ban big money legislation has forced the parties to raise money from individuals, we're on the same track, right? And I think that needs to continue, because that's what keeps us nimble, and that's what keeps us independent. And so I think we've done a really good job in the last few years weaning ourselves from the traditional sort of environmental world funding of grants and foundations. And we've got a higher and higher proportion of our budget every year that's coming from individuals. And so we can't lose sight of that as an organization. That needs to continue, again, in order to make sure that we can respond to these crises when they come up, and that we have like full editorial and strategic independence around how we respond and how we channel these resources in moments of crisis. We're going to have to find new audiences. I remember when Trudeau was elected, and a lot of folks who were, our friends when Harper was in power, they were happy to just, kick back. Once there was a new government, it was like, don't, give them 4 years. Don't be so hard on them. And we're going to see the same thing with Horgan. There's going to be a lot of comfortable, middle-class, centrist folks who were, quite concerned about climate change and Indigenous rights when Christy Clark was in power, who prefer a kinder, gentler approach to, accelerating the climate crisis, sending SWAT teams onto Indigenous land. If it's being done by progressive politicians, we know there's a lot of people who are just going to freeze, who used to be opposed to these things, but can't reconcile it with, their trust and admiration of the, the more progressive party. And so we're going to have to find new audiences. We're going to have to talk to people who are not reflected in our electoral system, but there's a lot of us who feel like things are not going in a very good direction, and that both major parties that have held power in BC are not walking the talk on climate change. And we need to become, I think, a vehicle for those folks, outside of elections and in between elections. There's work to be done in organizing that audience and in amplifying their voices. And we're going to have to keep adapting to COVID, right? Like these in-person events and door knocking and stuff, that's not coming back for a long, long time. And so we have to keep figuring out how to organize people in the era of social distancing, how to have offline events that are safe, that allow for that personal connection that is so important to building relationships, but also get better at organizing online and finding our people through the platforms that they're on. So yeah, I'm excited about it. I think this is, in a way, like, it's a relief to just know, okay, we've got a majority government for the next 4 years. It takes away all the guesswork and all the speculation and all of the questions around election timing. And, the minority government could have fallen at any time. And so we were always kind of waiting for the other shoe to drop. And now we know where we stand. And I think this is the time to regroup, to get really solid on our strategy, and to start moving those resources towards these frontline struggles. So yeah, I'm excited to be in it with both of you and with the whole crew at Dogwood and the volunteers and all of our donors and allies and the folks who are watching, the dozens of people watching our nerdy post-election show. Thank you for tuning in. Any concluders, any closing thoughts? What the next 4 years is going to look like? What you're excited about?
We should have planned this.
I feel like we've said everything.
Well, we can look at some trends. I don't think things are going to get less dark and scary in the United States. So our English-speaking neighbors to the south, our largest trade partner, the people who produce most of the media we consume, they're heading towards a really dark time in their history. And so there's a tendency to compare ourselves to the United States and say, haha, like we're doing so great. Nothing, it's not so bad here, right? And I think that lets our leaders off the hook for a lot of things, because they're like, oh, well, it could be worse. Look at the shit show in the United States. And so I think we're always going to have to push back against that, and to hold our leaders accountable, regardless of whether they're comparing themselves to Donald Trump. So that's going to be one challenge for sure. But there's just no way to escape the vortex. Like, whatever happens in the US over the next 4 years, I don't know what's going to happen in November in the election, but whatever unfolds as a result of that is going to have profound effects on our society, on our culture, on our economy. And so, yeah, when I think about the next 4 years, none of that is headed in a good direction. None of the indications are good. So it makes our work harder in a lot of ways. And I don't want to sugarcoat that. I don't think that we're going to see like some magical return to normal if Joe Biden wins the presidency. You know,
Mhm.
we are out of time to start dealing with the climate crisis. And so what the US does is going to have enormous influence on energy markets, on financial markets, on, you know, all of the other forces that shape our lives here too.
Well, and I think that's exactly when you said what's going to happen between now and 2024. That's exactly what came to mind for me is climate. I mean, we are at the end of, there's no more time. Like, we have 8 years remaining. This is the time to like stand up and take charge. And like, this is the time for governments to take action. Well, the time was actually like a long time ago, but we have no other choice. And we talk about that with youth, but for all of us, we have no other choice. So we all have to come together right now. We all have to take a stand. Public subsidies are one piece of the puzzle, but like, this is an urgent situation we are in with climate. And in 4 years, who knows what we're going to look like. I'm from the interior, so for me, it's very real. Every spring there is flooding, and every summer, fall, there are wildfires. And they take people's houses, and they take people's lives, and they take people's livelihoods. And those impacts are happening now, and they were happening 15 years ago. And the inaction is just making it worse and worse every summer. And like, we have no other choice. This is the point we're at now. So like, I guess this is an appeal to people, like, step up with us, and join the cause. Like, we need people to demand better of our politicians.
Yeah.
And I think, I mean, that's the question I go into the next 4 years is how do we be bolder, go further and faster, right? Like, that is what we need to do. We know that, as you say. And I think that we can't rely on governments, and we can't only put our pressure, we can't only put our eggs in that basket. And so when I reflect on like where we're going over the next 4 years, it's like that combo of government pressure and something else. Like, the kinds of mobilizations and outpourings that we've seen over the last year are those tipping points, those breakthrough moments that can switch us into further and faster. And that's kind of when I look for hope. I look to those kind of moments. Right? I don't see that. I don't get that bubble up of hope when I look at our elected representatives. I see it when I see those big youth-led, honestly, and people power, right? Like, that is what's going to that's going to allow us to survive if we manage to move further and faster. And it's getting that, making sure we are able to do both, and that we as a movement are able to like keep that pressure up on decision makers, but build that grassroots fire and that grassroots power that can allow us to get where we need to go.
Well, if I have one sort of hopeful takeaway, it's that the public is way ahead of our politicians on this, on Indigenous rights, who makes decisions on the land base, what we need to do in response to climate change, cutting off oil companies from fossil fuel subsidies, investing in renewable energy, and all these things. The public is way ahead of our politicians. Our electoral system is broken. It does not deliver results that reflect where people are actually at and what they believe. And so if we can crack the code and figure out how to start translating those values and those sentiments that people hold into the kind of urgency, I think we can drag our politicians along. They're not going to lead us into the climate fight. They're not going to lead us into the mobilization, the fight for our lives. They're going to have to be dragged into it. And they're dragging the oil companies behind them, right? And all of the lobbyists and all of the interests that are trying to maintain the status quo. They're going to always be in tension between the public and between those big forces of capital. And so, yeah, we're going to have to figure out how to just get our hands on the rope and just start playing tug of war with industry over the next few years. And our politicians are the ones in the middle. So, yeah, I couldn't think of a greater group of folks to be heading into it with. I'm really glad that that both of you were game to do a Facebook Live on a Saturday night at 11 o'clock. Thank you
Where
so
else
much.
would we be? I would rather digest election results than with this fantastic crew. So yeah, this is where I want to be.
All right, should we wrap it up? Say goodnight.
Do a Zoom wave.
All right.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Go wave. Goodbye.